I pulled a decent-sized sample of recently published articles from Google Scholar using just one simple search term: Tinder. And I went through them like a literature review, looking at things like what they actually assess, who they focused on, and what themes showed up over and over again. Across dozens of studies, we see consistent categories as topics in the published literature about Tinder and dating apps in general. So I'll discuss what gets measured, things like how that research is framed, and who all of the research is centered around. Instead of focusing on just one study article like I have in the past, I'm going to break this down like a miniature research review, including the types of studies published, things like what they're actually assessing, and common themes, as I mentioned, that emerged across that entire group. And for those of you who stay till the end, you'll see how those patterns don't just describe the use of dating apps. They help feed a broader narrative that makes you look like a monster.
It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life.
Well, there are probably a lot of people who assume that research on dating apps like Tinder gives a balanced picture of how men and women experience modern dating. For a lot of people, that might be intuitive. But when we actually go through the studies themselves more closely, what we find is not balance at all. It's very consistent patterns in which researchers choose to focus on several different topics and ultimately what gets published. Before I get into the details about the studies themselves and what's in them, here's some information about these study characteristics. So what I did was simply go to Google Scholar, I typed in the word Tinder, and hit the search button. I then copied the first 10 pages of entries, limiting it to 2025 and 2026 publications, and this is what came up. There were a total of 68 entries. I excluded 12 of them because Tinder also returned some articles that had to do with things like firewood. They were ambiguous or insufficient to classify as we needed. So the final sample included 56 articles. And for those of you academics out there, I get it. This is not an official research review. It's not systematic at all. This is just to get a basic understanding of what's happening in published research in the last year and several months. So here's what we find about gender focus. These are ones that explicitly centered on women's experiences like safety, harassment, fetishization, and vulnerability. Of the 56, 17 of them had that focus. That's 30% explicitly on women's experiences like safety. There were only 2, that's 4%, that focused on males, explicitly centered on males' experiences or outcomes. That's 2 out of 56. There were 37, that's 66%, that used mixed samples. But they typically were analyzed through gender differences. And here's some important nuance here. Of those 37 that were mixed gender samples, 24 still framed findings through female risk and other things like safety or disadvantage. There were 8 that focused on neutral behavior differences, such as motivations and swiping habits. 5 of them approached something that I would say is maybe a little bit closer to structural asymmetry, meaning matching differences. The topic distribution of those 56 articles, let's talk about that. Here's how those break down by primary research focus. Now, there will be some overlap here, but categorized by dominant themes, we have 18 articles, that's 32%, were focused on sexual risk, harm, and safety. There were 11, that's 20%, focused on self-presentation, signaling, and profiles. By that I mean profiles, their bios, attractiveness, and sexual signaling, things like that. There were 9 articles, that's about 16%, that focused on gender dynamics. Those things are like gender differences, female experiences, and inequality, and along with a little bit of male commentary, I'd say. There were 7, that's about 13%, had to do with psychological outcomes like loneliness, self-esteem, even a little bit in there about addiction and problematic use of the apps. And then there were some other smaller ones with smaller counts, such as motivations and behaviors in use, technology, algorithms, and platform design, things like that aren't necessarily relevant for our conversation today. When we break them down by risk-focused versus outcome-focused comparisons, right? So the risk, what is people's risk when they do use the app versus their outcomes, what happens when you do use the app, we see that there were 18, that's about 32%, had a focus on risk, or they were harm-focused studies, and only 3 to 4, that's 6 or 7%, focused on outcomes. And those would be things like actually matching and relationships that come out of the app use. That's a rough ratio of about 5 to 1 in favor of risk over outcomes of using the app. As far as demographics, there were about 80% of the studies focused on younger populations, and by that I mean college students and young adults. Underrepresented, as you might expect, were older adults, long-term relationship outcomes, and married couples that originated from the app. Very little attention given to those. So as a clean summary, what we see is from the set of 56 relevant studies that I found, about 30% explicitly centered around women and 4% around men. 66% included both, but again, many of them still interpreted through female risk. And at the same time, 32% focused on risk, harm, or safety, while only 6 or 7% focused on actual outcomes. So the bottom line here is that overall, this list shows research is far more likely to study women than men directly, and it is far more likely to study risk than outcomes. And even when men are included, their experiences are rarely the main variable that these researchers had studied or tried to explain. Now let's get into a little bit more specific details about what's actually in those 56 studies. This may or may not be surprising to many of you, but a large portion of what's published is built around women's experiences, as I mentioned, particularly around safety, harm, and risks. For example, one study even opens by citing a report that over 20% of women in Spain who went on Tinder dates experienced rape, and then explored contributing factors and prevention strategies for those women. That entire study is structured around female victimization and male perpetuated harm. Another study on what's called safety work repertoires analyzed how users, largely women, develop routines to protect themselves on apps like Tinder and Bumble. This emphasizes that the burden of managing risk and personal harm falls on them rather than the platform itself. And qualitative research studies show the same trend. For example, a study on black women's experiences on dating apps included interviews from women between ages 18 and 30 and examined how they are fetishized and sexualized in online interactions. Another international study on Tinder use in Indonesia examined how women manage uncertainty and risk in cross-cultural interactions on the app. And they do that by highlighting ambiguity in men's intentions, men's power imbalances, and women's vulnerability. And there are also studies that express men's gender-based violence, technology-facilitated abuse, and harassment, all of which frame the app as a space where women must actively manage exposure to men's behaviors. And what do they all have in common? They're all built around identifying, measuring, and warning women about their own negative male-associated outcomes. Even when the research expands beyond explicit harm, it still tends to reinforce the same message and framing. For instance, studies linking Tinder use to risky sexual behavior show that app use correlates with higher levels of sexual risk-taking. Other studies analyze psychological outcomes like women's loneliness, their self-esteem, and problematic use among women, often providing negative emotional effects tied to the app. Now, none of these studies are explicitly saying that men are the problem. It's actually one of the, I think, interesting points here. No, they don't do that at all. They don't outright come out and say that men are a problem. They let the assumptions do that work for them. But when the dominant body of research consistently highlights risk, harm, cohesion, and other negative outcomes, many of which are implicitly or explicitly tied to male behavior, those become the most documented and most reported aspects of male participation on dating platforms. While this is not by any means, as I mentioned, a robust or fully structured literature review, you get the point. There is very little research that directly examines the app and what it produces for men in measurable terms. So what we end up with is a body of research that is extremely detailed when it comes to female risk and their negative interactions, but comparatively thin when it comes to male outcomes and their experiences. And as I've discussed in several other research videos that I've done before, that imbalance does not just sit in academic circles. Those research findings get picked up, summarized, and repeated in broad circles. They show up in Huffington Post, in the evening television news, everywhere in public discourse, and again, as I've said before about research, often in political discussions. And when the majority of published findings emphasize harm, coercion, safety concerns, and negative behaviors, those become the dominant lens through which people make their decisions about what's going on. Over time, that continues the narrative that men are disproportionately represented through their worst documented behaviors. And keep in mind that all of the articles that I've included here were published, again, in 2025 or 2026. They're all brand new articles, and this has been going on for years. For me, the issue is that published research is skewed in a very specific direction. It prioritizes female-centered risk and harm, and in doing so, it builds a body of evidence where male behavior is most visible when it's negative. And when that body of evidence gets filtered into media and public discourse, it doesn't just inform the conversation, it shapes it. So that's how we end up with a system in which men are discussed primarily as a problem, because that's what the research has chosen to measure most consistently and to actually publish. For more like this that doesn't make it into my YouTube content, check out my Patreon where you'll find more like extended and uncensored commentaries and what topics I'll be covering next. Thanks for staying to the end. I'll see you soon.